Our next speaker, Alex Jordan, joins us from the Max Planck Institute of Animal Behavior in Germany. Alex's research, which often takes place out in the field, explores environmental factors that shape the evolution and maintenance of animal social behavior, particularly that seen in cichlid fish and social spiders. The title of his presentation today is Liminal Limnology, exploring the space between air and water, AI and ethology, art and science.
Hello, everyone. I'll let this play, actually. It's not the first slide, but let's ignore the technical difficulties that we're having. I've had an absolutely nightmare run to get here. I arrived about 15 minutes ago, having missed my flight last night. So this morning I woke up in I don't know, where was I? In Zurich, and now I'm here. And it's an absolute pleasure, so I'm really enjoying already the presentations we've seen and the opportunity to talk to you about this interface, and in particular, this idea of what animals perceive about the world and their interactions. I call the title today that I submitted, but unfortunately didn't update, Liminal Limnology, because I study lakes. I'm a marine biologist, mea culpa, but I also explore this interface between the ways we explore and understand, in particular, animal behavior, but also the methods we use and the approaches we take to do that. I'm very interested in challenging the sort of, as we heard in the video, the white lab coat kind of approach to science and to the sort of disengagement with our study organisms. I'm very interested in getting under their skin. So to give you a little scientific background about what I'm interested in. No? Fine. It's a very simple question, a beguilingly simple question, which is how does behavior evolve? And you may be familiar with this sketch that Darwin did in the margins of one of his notebooks about how he thought things changed over time. This is just sort of the initial image of a phylogeny, let's say. And for many traits and many of the things we study, color, size, ornaments, these kind of things, it makes a lot of sense to think about progression along an evolutionary trajectory, that things change gradually and branch out like this. But behavior is something very different to that. Behavior is responsive, it's continually updating, it's flexible, it's plastic, it's individually variable. And so it's not clear what we would even put on any of these branches if we were thinking about behavior. And so this is the goal of my research program. As you may be able to tell also from my accent, I am not a native of Germany. It's just that that's where the money is right now in science, so that's where I live. I'm initially from the global south. And so it's this kind of question that really drives me. But to answer this kind of question, you need a lot of approaches, and your research can take you in a lot of different directions. And so just to give you a little introduction into some of the systems that we use and the approaches. So I'm very interested in social spiders, as has been mentioned. I find these occupy this beautiful space both in our imagination, somewhere between fascination and fear, but also this interaction between the physical structures they produce in behaving and then how those physical structures modify and mediate their behaviors. They produce something in the world, and then that thing that they've produced controls how they interact with the world. I think that's a fascinating thing to think about and something that I'm continually interested in exploring. As you're also going to be seeing, I use a lot of tracking approaches, a lot of fancy visualizations, and that's entirely just to impress you. It's got no scientific, no, that's not true. It has some scientific value as well, but I'm very interested in videos and using artificial intelligence and machine learning approaches to expand our ability to understand what these animals are doing. I'm interested in the ideas of ornamentation and courtship. So this is some work we do on guppies, looking at how the males perform this courtship dance with respect to the ornaments that they bear, how they change the shape of their body, how they display themselves to the female audience in order to best showcase their attributes. And so this is looking at again, this idea of social behavior, but also behavior with respect to the physical self, not the perhaps environmental or structural world that you're interacting with. I don't just study animals either, I'm also interested in plant behavior. And that might sound a strange thing to hear, plant behavior, but of course plants do behave. They just do it on a time scale that perhaps is slower than we're used to observing. And so here we're very interested in this social interaction of sunflowers, how sunflowers shade one another and avoid one another, how the social dimension of interaction affects growth. And here, of course, you're seeing behavior sped up, but this is, of course, fundamentally no different to behavior in any other system. And finally, before I get into today's topic, this is a new system in my lab, a fantastic postdoc, Daniela, who will soon be super famous. So remember the name. She had a paper just recently looking at REM sleep in spiders and the potential for jumping spiders to dream. And so currently in my lab we have a lot of work going on showing spiders, a lot of visual imagery during the day and seeing how they react to that physically and whether they recall any of those movements in their dream states. Ascertaining what even is a dream is complicated, and ascertaining whether non-human species are dreaming is even further complicated, but this is some work we have in that direction. But today I want to focus primarily on aquatic systems because that is the primary system we work with in the lab, asking questions about when these animals, when these fish are interacting with one another and with the world, what are they perceiving about the world? What do they know about the world? What do they feel? What's important to them? Do they have preferences? Do they have desires? Do they have friendships? Do they have aesthetic values they're trying to either conform to or be attracted to? And again, here showing you some of these fancy visualizations. And as we heard in the introduction, we aim to do all of this work out in the field, underwater in places like Corsica, Lake Tanganyika in Africa is a big study site for us, Zanzibar, Jamaica, some quite nice postcard places to go, to be honest. And in those places, some of them are beautiful, some of them are less beautiful. Like here we have, this is the bottom of Lake Tanganyika in Africa. A bit of a muddy, grim kind of scene, but we try to get a broad picture of the interactions of every single individual in a social group to try and disentangle some of these aspects of how they perceive the world and how they interact with it, how they interface with the world. So the first thing I want to talk to you about is this angle of sociality and how important this is for all animals and even plants for that matter. And some of the work we've done to look into what is important in this interaction and is there any kind of advanced sociality in any of these species that we see. And so here's some work with a type of cichlid fish. A cichlid fish is one of the most speciose groups of fish. Fish are 50% of all vertebrates are fish, and cichlids are among the most speciose. It's a similar number of cichlids in the world as there are mammals, and probably you've never even heard of a cichlid. And that's okay, you're about to. And so these cichlids in the lab at least, but also in the wild, live in these social groups where there are dominant and subordinate individuals, or so we label them. The dominant individuals are aggressive, full of testosterone, colorful, they court, they chase, they're territorial. And the subordinate individuals are, well, we might call them meek. They're drably colored, they are not very aggressive. And the question we have here is if we wanted to influence this group, if we wanted to change the behavior of this group, and we wanted to seed information either with a dominant individual or a subordinate individual, who would be best at actually controlling what this group does or influencing what this group does? And the answer is somewhat counterintuitive perhaps, because even though the dominant males in this case are the ones that are best connected in their social networks and exert the most overt influence in their groups, if we want the group to learn a task, and here we teach them to differentiate some reward structures, it's actually these subordinate individuals that are the best at influencing what the group does, and that's to do with the ways they interact. Dominance in the way we use the term in animal groups has so much to do with aggression, but within these groups, that's perhaps not how they perceive one another. They don't perceive the aggressive individual as being the most important or influential or the most reliable source of information. With these approaches, we also look at the same things out in the wild. And in the wild, of course, you have a lot more going on, a lot more interactions, a lot more species that you're dealing with, but you've also got the environment itself that you have to deal with. And so in our work, we endeavor to incorporate some understanding of the environmental interactions that might mediate these behaviors and can demonstrate, for instance, that you might come to some conclusions in the absence of that kind of incorporation of information that are completely erroneous when you actually layer in these environmental attributes. And so here, just a little example. We can see that if we have these colored tracks here, that represent the way these fish move through space, we can see that at some point the group splits up. And we might think that that's some social element occurring. It just so happens that there was a big bloody rock in the way, so they had to move around it. And this kind of thing might sound a bit trivial, but it's actually very complicated and important when you're trying to understand the way animals perceive the world, to incorporate that world into that kind of analysis to ask whether there's anything else going on. The next thing we're interested in is what I've called aesthetic preferences. Do animals care about beauty? Do they have a sense of beauty? Do they have a sense of things that they prefer or not? Do they care about the shape of the world? Certainly they seem to care about the colors and the ornamentation on one another, but do they care about the world itself? And so here we work again underwater, sometimes working with these bower building cichlids that create these beautiful structures and care very much how that structure looks if you perturb it. But also with some of these shell dwelling cichlids that live in these fossilized shells in the bottom of the lake. And we've found that we can scan these shells and then recreate them with 3D printing and start to manipulate elements of how these shells look and the shape of these shells. Finding that they have these cute little fish that we work with have very strong preferences for what these shells look like. These are not just unthinking animals that dive into the nearest dark cave. They have very strong opinions, as it were, on how the world should be and how they choose to interact with different aspects of that world. That, in fact, has led us directly into some really fantastic collaborations with many artists. And so on the spider side, I work with a good friend of mine, Thomas Saraceno, who builds these architectural level sculptures based on spider webs. This is work with a Danish art collective called Superflex. And with them, we've been exploring this idea of interspecies architecture and co-design. And so here we have these structures that are human designed based on simple architectural principles that we think the fish in the ocean might like. What we then do is place these sculptures into the ocean, and we examine, using exactly the same techniques as I've showed you, how the fish use these structures, where they choose to be in these spaces, how those spaces interact with their social structure and their social behavior. And in this case, even where they're choosing to lay their eggs. These are some damselfish in Corsica, being surrounded, as you see, by barracuda, which are very interested in this spawning aggregation. And so then we analyze how the animals have used these structures, and we use evolutionary algorithms, which is a fancy way of just saying we use a sort of statistical moving forward through space to change the structures to be more like what the fish like, more like what the fish want. Then we take these structures back out of the ocean and we give them to humans, and we ask now, humans, how do you now like this structure that's been produced, co-produced by a fish? How can you use this structure? One of the early versions of that is something you just saw at the introduction, which is we built a very simple, this is the earliest version of this structure, which has since been updated to be much more preferable for the fish, and we put this in the Coachella Valley in the middle of the desert and asked how humans prefer to interact with this structure. Now, actually, as I was watching Mark's presentation, one of the major challenges we have here is that humans, when they just walk around such a structure, they walk around just the base of it. They don't have the three-dimensional access to this structure that the fish have, so they're using it in a fundamentally different way. And I've been speaking with a childhood friend of mine who's now a physical theatre director, whether we can break that third dimension and see if we can get maybe some acrobats or some other form of physical performers to interact more like a fish would with this structure that's been designed by the fish. But now I want to come to this idea of not just in terms of sociality and not just in terms of aesthetic preferences, but in terms of awareness. What does an animal know about the world? And in fact, what does an animal know about itself? And so this is some work that I've done with this very charismatic and beautiful fish, the blue streak cleaner wrasse, which is here, asking whether these fish know that they exist, whether these fish can recognize themselves in a mirror, and whether they can understand that the mirror is a representation of self rather than a representation of another individual, for instance, through a window. And you may have heard of this mirror test. It's pretty well known in the trade, let's say, and it was developed in the 70s by Gordon Gallup to examine both the onset of human self-awareness and self-consciousness, but also then applied to chimpanzees. And the idea of the test is that you place a mark somewhere on the body of the subject that cannot be seen except with the aid of the mirror. And it's relatively simple and elegant, and hence that's, I think, why it's had such impact. And if the subject looks in the mirror and sees this mark and touches itself to interact with or attempt to remove the mark, rather than touch the mirror, then it's clear that the animal or the subject, well, humans are animals, recognizes that the reflection is a representation of self. And the idea early on was that that was then indicative of self-consciousness. The animal was aware that it existed, and this was a representation of itself. Now, over time, different animals have been subjected to the test. Many animals fail, but some over time have been shown to pass. And as we go down the passage of time, you might notice that the suitability of the test starts to decrease, because what the test requires is that you have some kind of appendage that can move to a place in your body that humans would be able to interpret as self-directed behavior, as a behavior that's intended to remove this mark. So elephants, of course, are good. They have a big, long trunk. That's pretty easy for us humans to interpret. Magpies as well, they have a beak. But what if we got onto something like a fish? How would a fish, which doesn't have limbs that could be used for such a thing, even begin to approach this test? And is this test then a fair metric of self-awareness and self-consciousness if we're trying to place creation in the evolutionary sense rather than, well, to each their own, on some kind of scale, which is very much a tendency that we have as humans. Is it a fair test? And in fact, we tried this mirror test with cichlids, this group of fish, and none of them passed. None of them attempted to remove the mark. But that's a bit of a vexing finding, because you're not sure if they didn't attempt to remove the mark because they failed, they didn't understand, or they just don't care. They don't have an aesthetic preference which drives them to try to remove some discoloration, or discoloration is not even the right word, a different color on their bodies. And when I was living and working in Japan with my collaborators there, we began to think, well, which species would be good? Which species does care about marks on the body? And so we came to this fish that I mentioned, the cleaner wrasse, and the clue is in the name, really, right? It cares about cleaning. It cares about cleanliness. It removes these ectoparasites from the skin of client fish. And so it's got both the sensory ecology, but also probably the cognitive machinery to detect discolorations and be motivated to remove them. So we decided to pass this little fellow through the test. And the test has 3 pre-phases that have to occur before you supply the mark to the animal. The first phase, which is common in almost every species, is aggression to the mirror. And if you haven't looked on YouTube for these videos of mirrors in the jungles, if strangely that's somehow not been on your playlist, I recommend you put it on there now, because it's quite enjoyable to see all of the various forest animals try to murder this reflection. And most animals never get past this phase. And so you can have birds that continually attack car mirrors. If you're from my end of the world, you'll have parrots that destroy the mirrors. Most animals never get past this phase. If they do, they enter this second phase of contingency testing, mirror testing behaviors. They start to do things towards their reflection that they would never otherwise do. For humans, it can be making silly faces. Also for primates, you get some kind of difference in facial expression. But this is also a very complex part if we're thinking about more distant animals to humans. What is unusual for a fish? How do you interpret what a spider is doing that's outside of its normal range of behaviors? So this is a very interesting element of the test. In fact, it's the one I'm most interested in. But at any rate, this is the second phase of the test. And in phase 3, animals will use the mirror as a tool. So they'll start to explore their bodies in exactly the same way we would use a mirror in a changing room. They understand that this thing now allows me visual access to other parts of my body. I'm not going to go too deep into stats or figures, but this is a representation of the aggression shown towards the mirror. We have 2 panels here. The top panel is showing the reactions towards a mirror, and the bottom panel is showing reactions towards a conspecific, which is a member of the same species, across a clear glass divide. And so this is an important control, because all the behaviors, if they were identical in these 2 conditions, that would suggest they're treating the mirror not as self, but just as another individual behind some barrier. And so we get this very consistent with other species. Initially, almost 100% of the time, they're showing aggression towards the mirror. They are trying to kill this other fish across the divide. But then by day 7, it drops to 0. In the conspecific case, it's low to begin with and remains low throughout. Then, concurrent with the drop in aggression, we start to get an increase in these contingency testing behaviors, these idiosyncratic, strange behaviors. And I'm going to come back to what a strange behavior in a fish might actually be, but you get none of that in the conspecific. This is not an error. There are just no cases of that in the social context. And then phase 3, this exploration of reflection. Now, one of the things about fish is that they do not have what we call directed gaze. They don't have a foveated, well, Okay. These fish don't have a foveated region of the retina. You can't tell what they're looking at. And so to be conservative in your interpretation, all we can say is that they are in positions that would allow them to see their reflection if that's what they were looking at, if that's what they were paying attention to. But we cannot determine if they're actually looking at the mirror. Nevertheless, it's not such an important point, except to show that it's consistent with phase 3 in the mirror condition. And in a conspecific condition, they are always interested in looking at a social partner, whether that's for aggressive reasons or social affiliative reasons. Okay, so this top panel tells us that these fish pass through the first 3 phases of the test as behaviorally laid out. So now we can do the actual test, which is to provide them with a mark. But before that, let's look at some of these behaviors. And then I want you now to think about what would a fish do that would convince you it's performing self-directed behavior. Keep that in your mind. How would a fish do the equivalent of this? What are its options? So let's look first at, please. Yes. So this is aggression towards the mirror, the open mouth attack by this individual. You can see this is before I started my own lab, and I have I have a different aesthetic preference to this lab. This is not a tank I would ever allow to be on video. Anyway, but here we have some unusual behavior, and what you might notice here is this fish is approaching the mirror and swimming upside down. If anyone's had a goldfish as a child, when it's swimming upside down, it's not a good sign. And so here we have quite a clear diversion from normal behavior. And here is our self-directed behavior. So the fish will go to the mirror, look at its reflection, go down to the substrate where the mark is, and scratch that part of the body against the substrate, and then look back at the mirror. And so it's in fact that sequence of behaviors that we're interested in. This looking at the mirror, down to the substrate, and then back as evidence of this self-directed behavior. In this case, we had 3 of our 4 throat-marked fish pass this test. In subsequent studies, we've had 9 of 12, and most recently, we've had 16 of 18. This is the highest pass rate for any species in the mirror test, even higher than 14-month-old humans. But not adult humans, sadly. Okay, to finish up, I want to talk about behavioral language, because this, I think, is a really important aspect when we're trying to understand behaviors of non-human animals, for example, these idiosyncratic strange behaviors. How do we interpret those things? And really that's something we're doing through AI, because behavior, as I said, is not a chunkable thing. You can't take out pieces of an animal's repertoire and say, this is X and this is Y, at least not easily, at least not reliably. Certainly not in my field, and certainly not with some of my closest collaborators and friends. We absolutely do not agree on what we're observing. And this is a problem. And so here we use some of these technologies that are emerging to break down behavior into its constituent parts in a continuum, but the important part is those labels come last. So whether you want to call things in big groups or small groups or have no labels or have different labels really doesn't matter, because it comes secondarily. And so you can use these approaches that have been developed in less interesting species like fruit flies, and we try to employ these both in the lab, as you can see here, but also in the wild. So here's Lake Tanganyika, where we can examine the posture and movement over time of these animals in a continuum and ask, what are they doing? We can then track these things and represent them in any kind of quantitative space, and don't worry about that too much, except to say it's a continuous space that we can explore and represent, either in descriptive terms, or we can even recreate it. And so finally, I just want to leave you with our most recent work, which is where we have generated these avatars, these fish avatars, that are populated with the behaviors of real fish that we can then represent in different sequences, durations, contexts, and play them back to real fish, which we're now doing underwater in Lake Tanganyika and also in the ocean, and have a real fish interacting with an avatar that's performing a certain behavior. So if we think this behavior is courtship, or we think this behavior is aggression, or we think it's social affiliation, we can play that behavior back to the real fish and look at what the real fish does, look at how it interprets the behavior. So then we really have this babble fish, which is a real fish telling us as scientists whether we are right or wrong about our intuition and our interpretation of animal behavior. And this is the basis of an art installation that will be in Basel in August, and then also part of many future works, both in this virtual one, but also in this interspecies architecture co-creation, which has really brought forward a lot of our scientific work and inspiration. And with that, I thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to talk about these and many other ideas over the course of the day. So thank you to you. And more importantly than you, I'm sorry, all the local collaborators and the team in the field who make all of this possible. Thanks again.
So we have time maybe just for one question from the audience. I can
see hands, but you choose.
You then in the middle.
Maybe at the back there, I saw a hand go up.
Yep.
Thanks very much for this wonderful talk in both content and visuals. It's not my area. I'm actually a Drosophila geneticist.
Oh dear.
One of those less interesting species. I'll remember that. The Tanganyika lake and cichlids appear to be, according to what I remember, a hotspot for evolutionary biologists in terms of speciation and so on. So at the beginning of your talk, you talked about the difficulty of mapping behavior on a kind of phylogenetic tree. So I wonder, now that you seem to have made extraordinary progress with many different systems and so on, could you tell us any revelations about the evolution of behavior based on your work?
I can, provided I don't get quoted for this, because this is my current feeling. But it requires population. I mean, I'm wearing two hats here. If you want me to answer this in the pure scientific realm, we are working on behavioral ancestral state reconstruction. So we are trying to have stable behavioral labels at the end of these tree tips, and then trace back the ancestral state of these behaviors and the evolutionary trajectory of behavioral diversification. Okay? That's a scientific answer. But my feeling is that evolution does not create specialized machines for certain tasks. So we are looking, as you can probably tell, at 56 species, thereabouts, and trying to get behavioral repertoires for all of them, because they live very differently. Some are very social, live in large social groups, interact with many individuals each day, have differentiated relationships. Some live entirely solitary lives, and we can watch them. I don't do it anymore, but people in the lab watch these things for months, underwater, watching these fish for months, and they do nothing. It must be a very challenging task. And yet, if we take these species that do nothing all day, and we can never observe a natural, rich repertoire of behavior, and we put them in a context that might elicit that, they can do it. So it looks like evolution is producing generalized behavioral machines that can be expressed very differently and plastically according to context. And that's, of course, entirely consistent with what we understand of the development of the brain and the way that input-output works. And so that's the thing that you can't quote me on just yet, but I imagine in 2-3 years we will have enough of a data set to state that there is not strong behavioral evolution even in a system that is famed for its massive diversification in every other trait. That was a bit sciencey, sorry, but yeah. Great, thanks. Pleasure.